Welcome to the We Do Performance podcast with your hosts, Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai.
So a huge welcome to Bill Smart for joining me today. Thank you, Bill, for taking the time.
No, I appreciate it, Andy. Always good to chat.
I know. So what I want to do with this is kind of dive into a little bit of your history, because I think a lot of people know you from combat sports, but probably people don't appreciate just how much wealth of knowledge you've actually got. And every time I kind of see on a podcast, it just tends to be kind of like an overview, kind of what with the UFC lads. So give us a bit of a brief snapshot about your kind of history and how you kind of came in to the world of S&C.
Yeah. Well, how far back do you want me to go?
I'll let people know just that you don't just do UFC fighters, because you obviously get quite a cool job and stuff.
Yeah. So I've always enjoyed combat sports, and it was kind of always my passion. And in New Zealand, obviously, we're doing pretty well in the UFC now. Hasn't always been the case. And our Olympic sports, from a combat perspective, aren't massively developed like they are in other countries. So with that in mind, I had always, when I was younger, wanted to have this transition to combat sports, but mostly when it came to performance training, strength and conditioning, I was pretty interested in just trying to figure out how things work and, applying that to real life settings. So essentially, I have worked with a number of different sports. When I started, I did a lot of like high school based stuff, which was cool, a lot of like regional development programs. So I got a appreciation for like the athlete development process, which I think is quite valuable. And I think it probably doesn't get enough spotlight on, how you take people from the initial parts of, starting in a sport and, what that process actually looks like to getting to these elite levels. So I spent a lot of time in the development space initially, and then sort of moved on to and did a little bit in conjunction with some of these other elite-based Olympic sports. So sports like rowing, spent a decent amount of time at rowing, spent a decent amount of time in cycling, bits and pieces with both endurance and sprint, but more on the side of sprint and BMX, and mostly from a strength and conditioning perspective. So I initially came into most of this, had a sports science background. Professionally, am a strength conditioning coach in the combat space. Started off as a strength and conditioning coach, started realizing that the systems just weren't set up in a way that sort of allowed strength and conditioning to be effective. In which that's when I transitioned, I don't want to say more so, but to performance science and in conjunction with S&C. And essentially the goal was to try to fill a lot of the gaps that were not allowing the physical components of fighters to shine, really. So basically done that for the last 10 years and still doing it, still work in a combination of track cycling, BMX as my primary sports outside of combat sport.
See, that's fascinating to me because I've not had a massive amount of BMX experience, but I did have some ex kind of Red Bull riders that I was working with, and I just found it really, really kind of initially quite challenging, because I was like, what the hell? That kind of, what is this sport? It's just, and it was quite fascinating when we kind of really dove into it. And we found there's actually a lot more to it than you probably realize.
Massively. BMX is such a cool sport, like as a spectator sport as well. Physically, the athletes who come out of BMX, what's interesting about them is they start BMX very young. They develop these like nervous system qualities that most athletes don't at a very young age. So the BMXers we've had come through our system have been some of the most powerful athletes that we've seen. To the point where track cycling is like the flagship sport here. And often we had a girl, Rebecca Petch, who went to the Olympics in 2020. She ended up transitioning to track cycling, then went to 2024 Paris, won a silver medal in track cycling.
Wow.
And it's generally been pretty common that those athletes have been sought after within the track cycling sprint-based programs, which is very interesting.
So why do you think there is like as powerful as what they are. I was speaking to someone else that was saying to me that probably what people don't realize about kids that are doing a lot of BMX and or extreme sports is it's very like technically demanding. So they're building skills all the time. It's very, but and but sometimes they come in and they're kind of really untapped potential from an S&C
Yeah.
perspective because they've not had any formal, but they've got
Yes.
all the traits there because of the type of work they've been doing. So why do you think that is kind of like you've seen some of the best like powerful scores and stuff from them?
I reckon there's my thoughts around it. One, like I find the BMXers, the ones who stay through the system and do really well, they're quite gritty. As in, BMX, when you think about like the safety of the sport,
Yeah,
like if you've done the sport for a period of time, you've been smashed. Like all these guys, we think combat sport is hard in terms of the damage that you might receive, and it is, but like BMX is a whole nother level in terms of if you crash, and people crash all the time, it's bad. So I think there's a component of like the mentality that comes with that leads to more like consistency and robustness and grit when it comes to trying to get more out of it. And then I think there's something too that you're essentially doing sprints from the time you're a child, right? You're doing sprints from the time you're a child all the way through. So you're sort of, you're really learning how to like tap into the nervous system and put down power. Um, and I think that when you combine that with like the competitive nature of the sport, you do that over a period of time. I just think you unlock qualities there that you probably don't for majority of sports at that age. The other factor to it, I think this is an interesting one, is that when you look at BMX, obviously they like the cadence is very high because the resistance is very low. So they've got
yeah,
these really like short burst, high frequency movements, and it was cool. Like the video that John did on calcium.
yeah.
Um, I think that's like that the contract relax piece from a power perspective and the role of calcium in that. I think that's highly overlooked from a power perspective. Highly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's interesting because I was kind of doing a lot of kickboxing as a kid, and I remember doing skateboard and taking a couple of falls and thinking, bloody hell, I'm not doing that again.
Mm.
Even though I was sparring maybe 5 days a week and taking a kicking, it did not feel nearly as bad as falling off an ollie or whatever. And I remember thinking that it was interesting, and like we had a lot of recreational Thai fighters come in, and like people come into the Thai boxing class that were all like skateboarders and BMXers, and they could just take punishment like no one else. just kind of like, but it wasn't, yeah, but it wasn't as exciting enough for them as a sport. And and I've seen some pretty hardy snowboarders that have been completely totaled, broken everything under the sun, and come back and still had that mindset to go again. It's just, I
Mm.
think sometimes we underlook that. Sometimes I think you're right. Sometimes I think we think combat sports is probably the pinnacle of like punishment and everything else, and we forget that some of these other sports pretty gnarly. You need to be wild in a different way.
Completely agree. And I think I do, I think that if you can build that sort of grit um, early on, it'll carry through.
Yeah,
And I mean, so one of the athletes I work with, he's actually just recently moved to France for 6 months. His name's Bennett Grenov. So he was under 23s, right? Had just transitioned to elite. Um, he like the power that he could put out relative to body weight was ridiculous.
wow.
Um, like he hit a 95 vertical jump on a vertec, which is the equal biggest jump that we've had in Cambridge out of all sports.
Wow.
He's putting out like it's hard to explain with something that's comparable to numbers people to understand, but we've got this optimal cadence power bike that we use. That's basically I forget the official name of the research, but it's just got a big flywheel. It's hard to get going, and then you can
Yeah.
very rapidly apply power at the end of it. He was 2200 watts on that at 80 kilos, which if you were to
Whoa.
compare that to a watt bike, that would be closer to 2500, like
Oh,
as a
easy.
comparison.
Yeah,
Like at
easy.
least, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
like it's
monster.
just it was
That is
ridiculous.
that's
But
monster.
And so I started with him when he was quite young. Like, he's had horrendous injuries throughout the years on the bike. But every time he just gets back in, rehabs, gets back to training, and I mean, those are the numbers he put out right before he went away, which was only a couple of weeks ago. Just insane.
So what type of training do you do with them then? So I mean, what do you do with them? So if you get like a new athlete comes in and maybe like and that's kind of chosen sport and they've come in and kind of what kind of type of work do you do with them initially? What type of testing do you do with them?
Yeah, so generally in the HP system, it's all on the S&C side of things. So I
Yep.
work with generally it's working with the coaches. For BMX, there's a guy called Matt Cameron that I work with, who's essentially been the New Zealand coach for a while now, who's awesome. So we'll have a conversation, sit down. He'll have run essentially the periodization, like the needs analysis in terms of the bike, the physical, and Matt will have a lot of the normative data for the athletes. So he'll have sort of set work-ons, and then some of those will run. Most of those will relate back to some of the different components on the track. So for instance, you go around a BMX track. There's the time to the bottom of the ramp. There's sort of the mid part of it. Then there's the end part in terms of the track, and then there's obviously the different components in terms of the jumps, and then there's like the competitive part. So essentially, we'll break all of that down and then use that to sort of form the needs analysis for the sport. A good example with Bennett was he was so an under 23. At World Champs last year, he competed in under 23s. Crashed out, which was unfortunate. Um, but his out of the entire elite squad, 23 squad, he had the second fastest time down the ramp.
Wow.
So all of a sudden you're like, well, fuck, that's not a limiting factor. Um, in which case, so that was sort of testament for him in terms of his explosive power and strength ability off the start was very strong. Where he would lose it was he would lose a little bit in sort of the midpoint of the track, in which case, from a physical perspective, what you have is you have the acceleration off the jumps, and you have essentially like the high frequency, short duration pedal bursts at different
Yep.
points. So with Bennett, one of the things that we spent more time on with that in mind was essentially trying to train that frequency component a little bit, as well as filtering in some lighter load power work, while
Yep.
sort of maintaining and pushing the strength alongside. Um, so I guess that's an example of linking back the overall what do we need, from a physical standpoint, how does it relate back to the sport, and then what are the tests that we do. And generally they'll have a combination of track-based tests for time trials, combination of like bike-based tests, and then we'll do in the gym a jump profile in terms of loading. So these guys do counter movement jump, squat jump, and a 40% body weight squat jump, and then we do the OC which is the power bike. And that's essentially the breakdown.
Yeah, I want one of those bikes, I think. Absolutely.
Yeah, me too. I would love one out of here, to be honest. Like, they're so good. And like, actually, we'll come back to it. I got some pretty cool insights on some of that as well.
It's funny because me and John were chatting today with kind of Harlequin's rugby team, and they're totally awesome. They've got real good. I guess you get a real good understanding as well of needs assessment and what they're looking to do. And I think it's interesting. I think people that are highly successful are always kind of looking into like a detective story where they're trying to break down that needs assessment and try to find out where things occur. And I think that was one of the things that kind of really I kind of found fascinating about your kind of approach to kind of martial arts and MMA as well is that hunt for kind of where does the performance lie and how do you find it? But I think going back to your thing about development, and I worked a lot in youth development sport when I was younger as well, at active schools and things. And I think that is a great starting place for anyone because I think that teaches you a
100%.
lot of skills about different styles of athletes, different demographics, social diversity, and kind of like try to piece together all the different pieces of the puzzle to get these athletes to where they need to be. And I think that's probably my biggest bugbear in a lot West and Sea World is a lot of people move into it with no real kind of background and kind of base and different
I
sector.
completely agree.
You know?
Yeah, I completely agree. Whenever I have, because there's a lot of people who come out of tertiary education, they'll go straight into bachelor's, maybe even masters, and then they'll be trying to find a job, essentially in
Yeah.
an elite field for S&C. And I mean, a lot of the times that's hard, and it often doesn't happen because the experience component's so important.
Yeah.
But like aside from just the job aspect of it, like you got to build your skill set, and as the saying goes, you need to be a good generalist before you can be a good specialist. And
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
I've been doing this
Totally.
for over 10 years, and I'm only just starting to become a specialist.
I just feel lost every day. It's
Yeah, seriously, me too. I still do.
right. It's kind of, I was saying that to John this morning. It's kind of funny. It's like, I'll be like 53 this year, and I just kind of feel like I still have so much to learn and so much to kind of try and appreciate with different sports. And it's funny. And I spent probably quite a long time, the last 10 years, really in the boxing and kind of kickboxing scene. And it's but where I get my probably best results was kind of probably pulling ideas from other sports and looking
Mm,
at what was occurring elsewhere. And for me, it was always this thing that we had to do better. I was never happy. I'm miserable. So the wife says I'm miserable. So I'm never happy with anything. So,
I know what you
um,
mean. It's always, yeah.
but it's kind of that thing. Isn't it? It's like, I mean, I still feel bad when an athlete doesn't win. Even though that's not my component of
Oh,
the
yeah,
program.
me too. I
But
hate it. I hate it.
you know, yeah, I still go back and go, shit, what did we not do right?
Yeah.
It's kind of when
But I
Fraser
think,
Wilkinson, one of our pros, lost. I just apologized to him, and he was like, "No, no, I didn't perform in the night." But I was like, "Yeah, but I fucking should have known something
mm,
or been able to do something." It's hard. I think it's hard, but
yeah, I think what you mentioned before about pulling from other sports, I think it's so crucial. And I think that my um, my observation is that when you're having to pull from other sports, it's on a needs basis because what you're currently looking for doesn't exist in the sport that you're trying to apply it to.
yeah,
And if that's the case, if that was the case, and it did, then in terms of using that information to derive a competitive advantage, you probably wouldn't have the ability to do that. So I feel like if because it when it comes to like high level sports, it's all about where do we find competitive advantage, and I
yeah,
think like that is the I think that's highly crucial to providing something that other people don't have, and that finding what you're trying to achieve from an outcome
yeah,
perspective.
yeah. I totally agree with you. I think it's kind of interesting. It's when you look around the kind of landscape at S&C and you look at what people are doing. I think a lot of people are doing what they think is very niche things, but that it's not
Mm,
really well thought out. And then
yes.
you've got people that are not that highly prolific in socials, Bill, that are doing really good work, and
Yep.
it's kind of interesting to me. I often think it's a double edged sword in a lot of ways. Let's just dive into combat sports for a minute because obviously you had quite a lot of experience there as well. But you did some training yourself, didn't you? Do a little bit of kind of competition yourself.
Yeah. So I had a friend when I was going through my undergrad who was doing kickboxing. So I went to the gym with him, started training a little bit, and then decided I liked it, which was cool. It was funny. I had I had a really dumb injury over the weekend, the previous weekend, which was like disc based lower back, just
Ugh.
never fun. And so you go to your session on Tuesday, and it's pretty embarrassing to have to be like, oh hey, just gonna let you know I'm not gonna lift any plates today. Um, and this is with Izzy as well. So I told him that he was cool with it. But then I sort of thought on it, and that had always been my Achilles heel, really, physically since for a long time. Just always had these disc issues that would come up from time to time.
Right.
But I'd realized that actually, if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't be in that space right then and there because I initially got into more like weightlifting. First, it was
Yeah.
a bit of Olympic weightlifting. Tried to transition to powerlifting a little bit or do a bit of both. Was pretty untalented to be honest, and then ended up having just essentially I my body wasn't able to handle it super well. And you have a couple of disc injuries, and all of a sudden you start to realize that just movement in general is how valuable and important it is just for your
Yeah.
your mental well-being. And anyways, and that was when I ended up transitioning to combat sports and realizing the movement and flow and the art of it was something that really clicked with me. So yeah, I ended up I've basically done combat sports for the last 10 years, just from one piece to another. Done a couple of boxing fights, got a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. So I've trained pretty on and off for that period of time. Always just enjoyed it.
That probably gives you quite a good deep appreciation for. I think what a lot of people probably don't appreciate as well that are coaching is just the technical ability that's required and why
100%.
S&C has to marry up with that, because I think I see local to where we are, a lot of reasonable S&C coaches, but none of it looks transferable to me because they've got no appreciation of just how skillful the sport is, the timing, the
100%.
distance, the spatial awareness, the micro movements, the flow. And I
Yes,
think that's why I still love watching boxing and kind of
me
kickboxing. And
too.
it's just, I'm still a massive lover of super bantamweights, and I just the Lomachenko era and that precise micro movement, and people don't appreciate how hard that is to do.
100%.
You know,
Yeah,
and
it's funny. It's funny because I I've always been a big fan of the art, and there was even a period of time. It was funny. There was a period of time I decided like, oh yeah, I reckon I could start competing in mixed martial arts. So I started training quite seriously, and at the time, all my PD went from sports science stuff to watching instructionals and spending more time in the gym and just trying to like learn all the little things. I really got into it, and I was really wanted to. Push it a little bit harder and see what I could do, and ended up blowing my ACL, MCL,
oh,
meniscus, and then
no.
pretty much that was it for that. And I still trained afterwards. Didn't I went conservative, didn't have surgery, got back into grappling, did grappling comps after that. But that was kind of my push towards that, and then that transitioned me back into everything else, but with this like contextual understanding that I didn't have before. Which so in hindsight, like I spent all this time just studying the skill. Um, and it was so valuable for what I do now.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think for me, when I mean, obviously I did my PhD very late in life, but the reason for that was that I needed to find someone that I could do the PhD with that was as batshit crazy as I was, and that could appreciate doing something out the box rather than the conventional bring athletes in VO2 maximum.
Mm.
And I kind of sought out John Barbara because John's as batshit crazy as I am. So and John's got a real out the box view of stuff. And for me and him, it's been that whole idea of the art and the flow of the sport versus what physiologically is occurring within that dimension. And
It's so important though.
yeah, and I think it's such a fascinating thing. So if we think of combat sports in general from an energy systems perspective, would you think you really need to be an efficient combat sports individual? Let's take boxing for example. Use boxing.
Mm.
What do you think you really need to be successful? Because that's the one obviously where I'm quite fascinated.
Yeah, boxing's an interesting one, isn't it? It's always, I think for me, like, and if we talk a little bit about like historic preparation, and this is where, like I've been such a big fan of your work in this area. For me, my perspective on training, especially from a conditioning standpoint for a sport like boxing, is that, back in the day, everyone did things that made sense in terms of the relevance of the sport.
Yeah,
And then everyone started doing things because of specific energy systems, and they put that before the sporting requirements. And my like observations through that was that it wasn't making athletes better. If anything, it was making them worse, if that makes sense. And
yeah,
of course, like and of course this was only when this was probably taken to the extreme, in the sense that using that sort of that site in terms of top ups is different to formulating your primary conditioning around it.
yeah,
Um, And that's when sort of I think a lot of the work that you and John have done in this space has helped to bring things back to relevant to the sport with science attached to it, and that's what I've really liked.
I mean, it's interesting because I kind of lived through the whole, I guess, generational change from, back in the day. Well, we really never did any S&C. We just boxed. It was just everything we did was box, and we just did the long runs because our coach told us to do it, and we had to get weight off. But S&C when I was a kid, I mean, it was pretty non-existent, and it was interesting. Like, as a youth, going through that with no real S&C and seeing some very, really super successful athletes. And then when I went to MMA, went over to Matt Thornton's SBG in Portland, and when I was kind of involved with that, and they were very switched on the alive method, but there wasn't any real S&C there either. It was just drilling and drilling and drilling, and then there was a big change, and I think that change is where we probably lost sight of that, needing to understand both sides of it, and it's been weird for me because I just wanted to prove. I mean, I just had a very simple thought. I just said, John, I just want to prove that bag work and pad work could be a good tool, but it doesn't tend to get used as a good tool. And that was it. And it kind of snowballed from there because we thought, oh, holy shit, we've discovered this whole new biological model. And then we applied it. And then we started to realize that actually probably a lot of what we're doing is really ill-conceived when you think about it from an actual performance.
100%. I think, like, for me, it was from an observational perspective. You see a lot, you have seen over the past, and you still see today, a lot of athletes who don't do any formalized S&C. And they look amazing in terms of their in-ring performances. And, there are some people I watch and the way that they punch, how efficient they are, how they snap their punches, and all they do is bag work. That's their S&C. So for me, that kind of highlighted, like, okay, like, we need to, like, there's something to what's happening here, but that also relates back to what we do. And it really made me question a lot of the importance of some of the components. And for me, then it becomes like, how do we separate the positives versus the potential shortfalls?
Yeah.
From an energy system perspective or a conditioning perspective, it's kind of interesting because, I think traditionally every, combat sport training has been very, like, aerobic, quotation marks. Either boxers have done longer runs or they've done a lot of bag intervals. And or they've done like shuttles, like shuttle runs, or different types of running modalities as well. And, like, I've seen over the past number of years, some of that getting people pushing back on it, calling it old school, and I don't think that's intelligent. I think that a lot of the times the shortcomings around some of that, based on my observations, hasn't been the training itself. It's been just some of the implementation of it, whether or not it's from like a training load perspective, the training load is just unmanaged, or it's the recovery piece isn't being managed well. So I think that's where, a lot of your work has been amazing, because it's from a execution of an exercise modality. It's maintaining sort of what's been done, but it's doing it in an intelligent way. I think that just makes sense to me.
I've just got a very, I guess because I still coach, I was always kind of conscious that I don't like stepping on people's toes. And I guess the last 5-6 years, as our method get quite popular, you start working with a lot more athletes and things. So my whole idea was just to try and find something that's fucking simple, just something that could be done that
seriously,
it wasn't going to upset anyone, but we were still going to get the bang for the buck. And I guess for me, I just want to see athletes win, but I also want to see them train appropriately so that, that they're in their peak, and I think I still wake up every day really excited. We try to get athletes to be in a better place. And I still think we just know so little in a lot of ways.
Agreed. 100%.
It's just like, we're getting into a rabbit here, but when we spoke a while back about elasticity, and that has just fascinated the shit out of me. So I've been like, diving into things and looking at things and chatting with physios about ankle mobility, stability. Is it a thing? Isn't it a thing? Is elasticity? Because when I think about striking and I think some of those ballistic components, irrespective of boxing or
Yeah.
say MMA, there is certain intrinsic qualities that kind of transverse all of them mechanically and
Yes.
biomechanically. And you get a really good take on a lot of that, which is quite unusual as well. This idea of like elasticity and stiffness and all that type of stuff, which really fascinates me.
Yeah, I think I think we're so centered around focusing on the muscle that we sort of lose sight of, there are more ways to generate power than
Mm.
just through muscular contraction.
Yeah.
And when you factor in the endurance component of fighting, like the repeat sprint endurance component, that's massively important. And
Yeah.
I think that's a concept that I've just been fortunate to be around people who are quite advanced in this space. Like in Cambridge where I am, the level of expertise here is insane. So there's a guy called Angus Ross who's been on James's podcast, and
Yeah.
it's been one of the big um, areas that he's been operating within and working on basically since I've known him. And it's just fascinating. And I think like for me, like taking that component and then you start to break it down and you look at populations like the Thais who, they run, they hit the bag, they don't really do
Yeah.
any weights. But these guys are like just big elastic bands. And they can just go and go and go. And, it's like and we know that that we know that the energy contribution required for that type of contraction is very, very different to muscle. Um, and my assumption's always been with MMA, and this is still something I really would like to quantify this better, is that when you do so much grappling and so much heavy isometric muscular-based work, that you start to lose some of those elastic qualities, and you start to lose the function of some of those elastic bands. And if you're a striker, that's not ideal because the muscle will fatigue. Like, uh,
Yeah. I've been thinking about this quite a lot off one of our last chats as well about absorption of shock and punishment as well, and whether a lot of ISOs is stopping that almost natural shock absorption from occurring because becoming a bit more stiffer as we brace to
yeah,
impact. When you compare
yeah,
ties and they're so relaxed, a teep comes in
yes,
and they just kind of sink into it. And it's almost
yes,
like, yeah, it's like an elastic band. They kind of
yes,
roll back and come back out. And I've been thinking about quite a lot. And I've been thinking about from the point of view of snowboarders, skateboarders, BMXers when they fall. Like,
mm,
'cause some of them come off at some crazy angles, but
yep,
they're just quite elastic in the bounce. They just go
yes,
and get back up. And then you look at,
yes,
and I think you could be right on this. I think that because we spend so much time either doing ISOs or doing a lot of kind of shortening the muscle through concentric work, that maybe we are losing that ability to have that kind of elasticity in the tissue. Maybe we're losing something to kind of change the shock absorption rate as well. And I think you see it later in fights as well when
yes,
athletes really fatigue and they start taking hits on the gloves and the
yes.
hand. The reaction time, the ability to come back off the elasticity component seems to be missing. And I kind of wonder, is that training or is that just natural? I don't know. I think of this quite a lot after our chat. So get
No, I totally
notebook.
agree. That's a great call. Like, and I think when you look at like as the rounds go on, and people become muscular, like muscle fatigue, the solution at current is to train the muscle more, make it more fatigue resistant. And that's probably a part of it. But like maybe there's another solution because you'll see the difference between people who are able to sort of maintain their like fluidity and bounce over a long period of time versus the person who starts that way and then it stops.
Yeah, it's a good
And
point.
I think that it's very interesting. It's a very and I think when you're talking about as well some of that like shock absorption, the like the whether or not it's the inability to to switch off the muscle from a relaxation standpoint that plays into some of that as well, and that plays into some of that fluidity component. And then
Yeah.
the factors that play into that, yeah, it's complicated, but I think it's a big area.
If you think about, you've done a Wingate, so you hit your supermax, and you hit your second Wingate, your third Wingate, and then you see when they stop the test, suddenly oxygenation flows at a much faster rate, even
Yes,
though they're completely fucked. You look at
yes,
sparring, and you get the same thing. 10th round, end of the bell, don't oxygenation just occurs because they're relaxed and the muscle tone
yes,
starts to
yes.
relax. Yeah. And I think of this quite a lot. And I think if we could encourage that amount of relaxation in earlier
Mm.
rounds, but that could just be a central drive or maybe afterward feedback. There could be some mechanism that the body just goes, right, we're finished. Done.
Yes.
So maybe John would maybe argue that you maybe wouldn't want that. You just want maybe more kind of calcium sensitivity and sarcoplasmic reticulum or that good stuff. But I
Which
think
could
it's
be a part of it.
yeah, no, definitely. But I think there is some. I've been looking at a lot of sparring data and I look at it and I look at the Wingate data, the same athlete. I think it's just interesting that the last round of everything they do, when it stops, the heart rate comes down quicker,
So
oxygenation
true.
goes up quicker.
I've experienced the exact same thing.
So could we squeeze that in during? Could you get that same relaxation, or would that be too much? That's what I'm thinking too. How
Yes.
do you mean, could it be too much of a? Then you would maybe get the same drive off kinetically as they push off in the other round. So I kind of wonder about it because it's just really pronounced. You know that end point, which is really. And I've been thinking about that in the context of what you've been discussing. I've been thinking there's so much we don't know. Just
No, seriously, like, and it goes back to what we were talking about before with trying to pull things from other sports. It's the
yeah.
best thing that we can do to inform intelligent innovation. It's probably the best way to put it.
It's crazy because we know very little about contact. And we were discussing this with rugby teams about trying to look at the effect of, contact using GPS data to look at runtime and whether persistent contact affects repeated sprint interval ability over time. And when you actually look at it, you realize we know absolutely very little about what the effect of contact is on the human body from a performance perspective. But yet, we're all
Yes.
in the combat sports space, which is
Yes.
the one area where we should be able to maybe like elicit what kind of effect that really has. Because yourself, you see it. Your athlete's doing really, really well. Somebody gets clipped with a right hand or maybe takes an elbow, and then suddenly hands go up, takes a lot of punishment, but can't ride through the punishment, and the fight gets stopped.
Yeah.
Referee jumps in, boom, fight's over. There's nothing as I guess as heartbreaking as that when your athlete would have had the conditioning to survive that extra
Yes.
15,
Yes.
20 seconds if they had just got to the bell. But it's funny
Yes.
how much it seems to sap the body. It's
Yeah.
kind of that
Yes.
constant
Like
bombardment.
you're so right. Like from a stress response standpoint, some
Yeah,
some athletes, and I guess like some of the best athletes I've seen, the way that they manage stress in the lead up to a fight is nuts. Like very, very relaxed in the lead up to a fight, whether or not it's the fight week, it's the fight day. Um, and then there are other people that don't. And then that changes things from a physiological perspective and an energy perspective in the ring. But then the next stage of that is how do you handle hardship in a contest? And that's very interesting.
yeah. And is that predominantly driven by psychology as well?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and what kind of effect does that have? How, and the other thing for me as well is we still don't probably know how much adrenaline change over rounds, especially if you think Izzy, or you think really high end athletes that know
Yeah.
maybe the round's not going the way they want. How
Yes. How
much,
does it?
yeah, how much does that adrenaline affect it? Because obviously there's a
Mm,
real push to get out. Come on, let's go. We need to win this round. You need to pick up the pace. There's so much to it, and I think this is the fascinating thing for me is that strength and conditioning is intrinsically related to it,
yeah.
but
100%.
but we still don't know where it all fits into to an extent.
And I think with that, it makes me think a little bit more about, I think what gets trashed on the internet is like the idea of mental toughness like injected into training. And of course, there are there are ways to do that intelligently or not, but it seems crazy to me that that there can't be value in some of that. If you can make it,
Yeah, it's funny because I mean I've had the pleasure of working with like firearms officers and some special forces, and we used, and even in our competitive Muay Thai class, we used to make people do shuttle runs and solve maths problems. The idea of being so we started it with the kids actually. So in the kids class, we used to say, right, 4 is a jab cross hook cross, 5 is a jab uppercut hook backhand low inside kick. So we would then say, is there shuttle run in 20 minus 10 plus 5 minus 4 is? And then they had to unlock the combination at the end of the shuttle run. And we had kind of like a senior firearms officer, and he went, that's pretty interesting, pressure testing. He went, that would be ideal for our firearms officers because they need to be able to do task relevant cues and mental acuity.
I like that.
So it's kind of been a big mainstay of how we've always trained. Is I'll say athletes, this is a combination. This number means this. This means this.
Yeah,
and they hate it. They fucking hate it. It's just like, why didn't you do that? And I always go, because you need to be able to listen to your corner, and if they say to you something, you need to be able to act on it. So let's develop that in a high stress position and see whether you can actually do it.
It's funny because so Matt, the BMX coach, does that with his riders as well. He'll give them these gnarly sprint efforts, and then they'll be doing maths problems in between, or just things that just keep them engaged, because like BMX is such a mental sport. Like you need to be able to stay focused, you need to be able to switch out. Like there's a massive mental component to it. So like for them, and maybe for combat sports as well, like you're saying, you've got to listen to the corner. Like that's a sport specific skill, and we train all these other sport specific skills. Why shouldn't we extend that to other areas? And then it becomes what for as an individual, what do you carry in that area versus someone else? And I can definitely say that the people who are a little quote unquote weak in the training room, like not resilient, you do see that in competition when things don't go well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd agree with you. I mean, I think, I was saying this to somebody earlier on today. We were chatting about sprints, and I said to them, look, bike sprints are not sport specific. Nobody's becoming a cyclist. What it is a mitochondrial. It's a mitochondrial tool. It's a tool driving, but it's also a mental tool to see how dark can you go. Can you go into the forest and stay?
100%.
And I think for anyone that's performing at a really high level, I think that's a real core fundamental skill they need to have. And I think this is probably why you see athletes that are maybe not particularly great, never had S&C, perform really poorly, but when it comes to fight night, have that ability just to ride through. Maybe like your Stricklands and all these type of characters that just have that crazy mindset. I'm going to come on my front foot, tight high guard. I'm going to ride it out, and I'm going to get my every dog has its day moment where I'm just going to land that big loopy overhand right. And I used to say, and I say to our fighters, you need to be careful of those people because that's the fucking people you want to use your jab and keep them away from you, because they're just going to suck it all up and try and find this magic moment. And 9 out of 10 times they might find that magic moment, even though everything else is shit in their program. And and it's kind of funny, and it's like we say to students a lot: don't overcomplicate things. Try and elicit what does the athlete need. So another interesting question I've got for you is: so say you've got an athlete that's maybe flagging in the 3rd round.
Yep.
So how would you contemplate fixing that? What would be your strategy if, say, for example, 3rd round just was always a really bad round, really slow? How would you elicit that? Because I'm fascinated with this, because everyone has a different way of dealing with this. And I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way in this one. I think this is one of these interesting ones that we condition athletes thinking that they're going to manage all the rounds. Now, we used to have an athlete that flagged in round 5. I mean, fucking without failure, round 5, he would be like, my legs are heavy. And I'd be like, we've done all this training. You're good. There's nothing wrong with your legs. But interestingly, when we moxied him, round 5 was a clusterfuck.
Really?
So
interesting.
Yeah. That was like the big eye. That was one of the big eye openers for me. Like, I used to just think, right, he's just having a bad 5 round. He's feeling sorry for himself. Just suck it up, get out there and do it. But actually, when I moxied him, round 5, it was such
Yeah,
poor
yeah.
recovery that I thought, wait a minute, I'm being too hard on the lad.
Yes, yes.
There is something going on there. But
Mm,
trying to resolve it was a real big challenge, because how do you take someone to the level of round 5 fatigue?
yeah. Oh,
And
you can't replicate it, can you? You can get as close as you can get in the training room, but you can never replicate it.
yeah. So what would you do? So what would your thoughts be around about that? You get a fighter that's maybe flagging in the third.
Yeah,
Which
I think initially it would be, if you were to, you need to break down if it's technical, tactical,
Yep.
or if it's physical first. Because I think, sometimes people are, there was an example of um, a heavyweight guy somewhat recently who ran out of energy, but in terms of his ability to conserve was not great. So I think you first have to separate tactical error and how you can fix that on a skill specific side of things, and then look at the physical side of things. And then from the physical side of things, for me, it's a combination of testing. So maybe testing observations. Like the way that we
Yep.
test is we generally, and it's not as clear cut as I'd like it to be just based on current systems, but I like to test at every sort of phase change. So the last testing would be 5 weeks pre, the testing before that would be 9 weeks, and then 13 weeks, like prior to competition. Um, so that sort of informs in terms of any deficits in the profile. My hope would be that if I observe that in competition, that would link back to something in the testing. And that
Yeah.
could be the SMO2 profile. It could be something like threshold 2, which
Yep.
has been a common one. And in which case, from a physical perspective, it might be a combination of looking at one top ups in that area if needed, but also it's a play between that and the sport specific training. Like they need to have something that ticks that box, slash we're able to observe that is similar from a sports specific setting. I can give you an example as well. Like we used to have within the gym this one session that was quite a hard sport specific session, where the guys would essentially do a combination of like bike and wrestling. And they do that for a period of time, which was sort of 4 minutes. It was probably mirrored off some of the VO2 like long intervals,
Yeah.
done in a sport specific way, which was quite like an interesting session, a good session. I applied at the right time, but there were some issues around what's happening within. That's a 4 minute round. You're fighting 5 minute rounds. Or what's happening in the last minute?
Yeah.
And there was some observations made in that last minute in terms of things that could be better. And that was in that context, those rounds needed to become more sport specific, and that's when they became 5 minutes, and we stretched that out. So that was a component of that as well. So more like exposure to the specific demands from a physical perspective is probably part two, and then part one is looking at that physical profile and trying to observe any errors that cross over. And truthfully, I get very excited when I see errors in the physical profile that mirror what I see in competition, because all of a sudden I'm like, yes, we're looking at the right stuff. Um,
I think that is so crucial, and I think that's the difference between what I would call high performance coaching, and I don't necessarily mean as in the technical coach, but I mean like
mm,
from an S&C perspective as well. Is that I think a lot of S&C coaches don't spend any time observing what's actually happening in competition. They just
mm,
maybe take feedback from a technical coach, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes that interpretation of what's taking place really differs from what the technical coach thinks they've
yeah,
seen versus what you actually see when you watch the footage. And I think you need to look at the footage and try and marry it up and go, what happened there? And that's why I developed the bag intervals, because I was always contemplating that I needed to drive the bag session slightly better, because I just felt when they were on their own, they would work
yes,
hard, but
yes,
it wouldn't be
100%.
representative. So this is why we way back, David McAllister, who I worked with, was brilliant with. So he just made sure everyone under polar and was monitor all the sessions just religiously, not working hard enough.
Right. And that's a great point as well. And that's probably something I should have input into that is, before you change the session, you need to make sure you're getting what you intended to get out of it. So if they're just simply not meeting the requirements because they're not meeting the intensity or whatever it is, then that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. And if they are and you're experiencing the same problems, then it's not the right session.
It's funny in combat sports because I think there's a lot of S&C coaches doing really good work, but it's very limited just weight style and what bike sprint, and they're not transferring it into, say, pad sessions or bike sessions. Now, I mean, I've got the luxury that I am still a very technical pad coach, so a lot of people will come specifically to pads with me because I'm very anally retentive over it. Your hip's not in, you need to bring the hip into position, the shoulder's not right. I'm obsessed with that shit. But where our biggest bang for buck has been developing the bike session intervals based upon heart rate recovery and how they recover in sparring to mirror it. That for us has been, because for me it was like, how do I get an athlete that maybe I'm doing remote with that I can fatigue them to the 5th round and then change that 6-round interval so that it's a bit more. So a lot of times we'll do is like 20 on, 10 off for the rounds, and then when we get to the round with our flag, and that's where we'll suddenly go, right, you're going to do 10 on, 5 off, and we drive it that way to try and replicate it. And it's not 100% because, as you know, and as you've said, you're not going to get exactly the same as competition, but I guess a lot of what we're doing is trying to get as best a fit as we kind of possibly can. And I think it's challenging though. I think the other thing with sport, as we both know, is that you can be in the best shape of your life, but it just doesn't come together on the night.
Oh, 100%. But I think like going back to talking about like the observations and competition, I mean, for me, like that's the only part that matters. Well, like you are like, if you can't make it happen in competition, of course there are things completely out of our control. But like observations and competition is, there's a lot of truth in that. And I think for me, like that's the big one. But then, like you mentioned before, like you need to make those same observations in training, like in sparring. Because if you're not seeing it in sparring, then you're probably definitely not going to see it in competition.
Yeah.
So that for me, like, because I think I think transfer gets lost a little bit, and if what we do physically hasn't got the ability to transfer into the components of the sport, then it's essentially a waste of resources.
Yeah, and time. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Yeah, I think, sparring's one of the more frustrating things for me with athletes that I work remotely with, that I don't have any control over the spar, the partners, or the
100%.
opponents. And I find that really difficult. And that's just a failing on my part. But, I have a rough idea what I want to try and get my own athletes at sparring. So when I work with other boxers and I'm not fully immersed in the team, and I'll go, how is spar today? And I'll look at the data. I'll be like, this shit, this is just not going to prepare you for competition whatsoever. But it's not my place because it's up to their coaches to do that. But it is a challenge. And I think my biggest challenge with a lot of coaches is that because a lot of technical coaches don't want any involvement in heart rate data, they don't want to look at data, they just want to do the technical side. It's very difficult to say to them, like, this round's breaking apart.
Yeah.
We need better technical acuity in that round. You need them to be breaking away at the centre of the ring, holding position, recovering, then going back in for a second phase of attack, etc. It's quite challenging, which sport is challenging, but I think there's a lot more to it. But on a separate note, I want to chat briefly about, because you're the only other person I know, other than a couple of rugby people, that are using NIRS.
Really?
So yeah, I mean, very few. There was a few other boxing groups in the UK that asked me to potentially show them how to use NIRS, and I kind of didn't really pursue it too much because they didn't really want to learn NIRS for the sake of expanding it. They just wanted to use it as a marketing ploy that they were using near infrared. But you're the only other one, person I've spoken to, has actually been diving into the rabbit hole, which was totally fascinating to me. So I was like, so why did you go down that route? Because I'm kind of curious.
Well, so initially it was when I was looking at putting together our testing protocols for CKB, I was essentially just looking into, what are the best ways to to look at things from a big picture perspective. And of course, I've always been among the opinion that it's good to align with the governing bodies of your sport. Like the closest thing to a governing body for professional MMA is the UFC. So
Yeah.
so we tried to mirror a lot of the UFC testing, and basically the UFC was using them. There wasn't a lot of information on how they were being used, and it sounded like it was early stages. But essentially that made it that sort of started the association. I started having a bit of a look into it, and basically just on a whim, just got a couple of Train Red sensors and then started testing them. And probably for the first 3 to 5 months, at least 3 months, I was just taking data points. I tried them on myself. I was taking data points on tests, on different training sessions, and I just wanted to just see what would happen. And I didn't really know what I was looking at, but I was trying to find trends that existed while trying to learn more about the technology. And what I ended up seeing was a lot of the highest level athletes that we just had these SMO2 profiles that were vastly superior to athletes who weren't.
Yeah.
And because when we started, we really were trying to get as much information as possible. We were lab testing. We were in the labs doing full VO2, metabolic cart, lactate testing. We use Moxies in the labs for a little bit as well, as well as some of the Train Red in some of the other areas. And for me, it was really what sticks out with athletes who perform better or at higher levels than the athletes who aren't as much at those levels. And the more we did it, the more that the SMO2, whether or not it was the desaturation efficiency, it was the recovery, it, it was vastly superior in terms of being able to differentiate than basically anything else that I looked at. And of course, then the number it was reasonably low, but it was enough to really make me think there's probably something to this. And essentially, it's become one of the most. It's literally become my most valued piece of kit. I use it all the time. Even we don't do lab-based VO2s anymore. I just chuck the Train Reds on them. We use that to try to establish where thresholds are. We use it on our Wingate-based assessments. And it seriously it's given me so much more power to influence training structure than if I didn't have it. Just because it answers the question.
It's interesting because I spoke with Duncan on some messages way back about we were using them or were they using them, and at that time they didn't, and they were going to chat to us about it, and it never kind of happened. And I was kind of curious as to what they were doing with them, because I think at that time in the combat space, me and John might have been the only two playing around with them, and we had definite thoughts on it, but we were struggling to find other people using them to see whether other people were seeing the same thing. So it was kind of interesting. I spoke to you because yeah, you're kind of finding similar things, and we're 5 years into this now with them. We've got, I think, I always think we've got quite a good handle on it until we do something different, and then I think actually there's a lot more we kind of need to do. But Train Red are really, so I mean, I've used Moxies quite a lot. I have a good relationship with Roger, a great team. But I have to say, I've been well impressed with the Train Reds. And the new ones, which I just discovered the other day, chatting to the lads, stores the data on them as well.
Really? I think I remember you. Yeah. Mentioning.
So actually, and it's so simple. I can't even believe I didn't notice it, but it's because I got a MacBook and a Windows machine. Plug it into the Windows machine, it pops up like a USB drive, and all the files are there.
Really?
Yeah.
Fuck, that's awesome.
But that is a big game changer now, because we've always spoken this before, but try to get some MMA data, and rugby data for us is quite crucial as well, because we're in that space quite a lot now. And I've been thinking, I love the Reds, but I don't want to have to be running behind someone with a phone trying to capture the data. But now I know it's stored on it, and it looks to me, I could be wrong, but it looks to me like it's almost 32 gig of storage on it. So it's going to store a shitload of data. So
that's so good.
And it's all 10 hertz. So, and you don't have, I mean, I love Moxie to bits because all my research was initially done by Moxie. I got a lot of time for Roger. But the offloading the raw data from the Moxie sensors is quite a painful process. I mean, it will improve. I'm pretty sure Roger will fix it. But the Train Reds are so thin and just so light. And I have to say that I can't remember the last time I actually used a Moxie sensor. It's just, we've just been using the Reds all the time. Just,
Yeah, for me it was just, in terms of practicality, there's nothing that can compare, and that was like, for me, it's got to be practical enough, because if it's not practical, it won't be used consistently, and if it's not used consistently, then any power from the data is significantly less.
yeah.
So like, just the ease of use and for what you get, and the ability to separate different physiological characteristics, it's been game changing.
I think the thing though, I think the only downside to NIRS is I think conceptually people have a hard time with it. I think, my experience, I mean, I've taught a lot in NIRS. We've taught a lot to students and stuff, so we got a lot of students using them. But it's interesting because I think, it's very easy to look at high value and low value, but not actually look at the slope exchange. And I think once you get your head around about how much oxygen has been extracted, then you get into a real interesting world. But I agree with you. Like, I mean, we've spoken this before. We've got carts and we've got the caliber masks and stuff, but it's just, I can just put these Reds on them and just, like you can start to list out where you think a VT1 would be, where a VT2 would be, where the lactate would be. And it just makes life a lot easier. But I've been using them with high rocks athletes as well to try and get another, because I'm really interested. I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm really interested in the high rocks. Because in many ways it's like a 1K run into a transitional stage. And I'm actually fascinated with the transitional stage between the 1K to, say, a sledge pull.
Yeah, I like it.
Because that component there, or where they go from the run and they slow down and they walk into the rock zone, whatever it's called, I'm fascinated with what's occurring there from a muscle oxygen perspective. Because I suspect if in competition with athletes, we can get the breakaway from the push away or from the clinch and get that natural resaturation to occur, theoretically, we should be providing our athletes with a lot more oxygen utilization to push again and again and again. But as you and I both know, in the MMA space, there's nothing there. I mean, we've got a couple of papers, one in peer review, which is another boxing paper, and I've got a VR boxing study that's happening just now. And after that, I kind of want to focus a little bit more on MMA and look at it, because I suspect.
So interesting.
Yeah, well, we'll get this happening.
We need to.
Because I think one of the big misconceptions is that you can train an MMA athlete like you train a boxer.
Yeah, totally agreed.
And I think what you see is because they have a shared striking component to some extent, there's a lot of people just training them exactly the same. And I just don't think that's the way to do it.
I totally agree. And I think that's an area that would be very cool to start to break apart a little bit. And I messaged you the other day talking about the difference in profile between fast twitch athletes essentially and not. And for me, that's a very interesting area, because like the trend, and again, it's a slow, it's a very small, n equals 3 or something at the moment. But I'm just so interested with the profiles that these guys are putting out, how they compare, but then how that links back into the training, basically, and if there are different components of training that we can mix in to better emphasize these types of athletes versus some of the more endurance-based athletes.
Yeah, I mean, endurance is. I mean, it's interesting when you look at endurance profiles. You see that steady state. So when we did the boxing data, and we noticed that obviously you have this initial DSAT and you move into this kind of steady state, and endurance athletes have the steady state also, but the SMO2 availability is a much higher steady state than what it is in the combat sports athletes. So there's a higher level so there's a much higher level of SMO2 availability. So I found that quite interesting. And then obviously, if you look at it and you look at, say, an endurance athlete may have a VO2 max of 75 to 85, but during the run, they're actually really only using probably about 40% of the max VO2. So if you compare that to amount of O2 availability, that kind of makes sense. But it's a very shared variance in the difference in the signal between that and other combat sports. So there is a similarity. There's just an availability difference. So I'm interested in this whole, I've seen this to John as well. I'm really interested in this idea of how do we better profile athletes in order to understand what does that availability look like from a normalized perspective? Because we don't know.
100%.
Because the other, so I'm thinking now about, should we be doing much more ultrasounding and looking at the total amount of muscle mass? Because if we think about it, right, we're only really looking at, say, a rec fem muscle or a vastus lateralis muscle. So theoretically, what we had discovered is we were taking a snapshot of the muscle, and then what we're doing is doing our sprints or whatever, or our bag sessions, and coming back and taking another snapshot of the muscle.
Yes. Yeah, nice.
And then what you see is when you take those two images and you look at the amount of light pixels and dark pixels, and you can see and I've got the app does that, and you compare the two of them, you will see a difference in the amount of dark pixels. So the amount of water availability is substantially changed. So theoretically, and I think this is what Ineo is doing with their Muscle Sense app, is they are coordinating the change in dark pixels to the amount of glycogen depletion in the muscle tissue. So when I was looking at that, I was thinking to myself, well, theoretically, because we're only looking at, say, a muscle, if we could get an idea of the amount of muscle mass and the amount of difference in water, we could theoretically look at how that would affect potentially O2 availability, and then really profile the muscle. So that has taken us to the study that we're doing just now, which is we're measuring the rec fem, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and hamstring muscle.
Yeah.
Because what I'm interested in, especially in striking, is what is the proportion of muscle being used in a sequence?
Yeah, interesting.
And that way you can look at what is the option demand, say, in the rec fem on, say, a 1-2. What's the demand on, say, a Muay Thai round kick? What's the demand on a sprawl? Is there a different need to train different muscles? Because in my mind, I'm thinking that way you would train a wrestler predominantly maybe slightly different from a muscle oxygenation perspective. Maybe something like Izzy, it's a really much more stand-up, really good striking. Maybe you want to change that O2 profile specific to that kind of structure. And that's kind of where my mind's going. But how we elicit that, I don't know.
What are your thoughts in terms of like the influence or effect of hypertrophy on mitochondria, SMO2?
So I've probably got a different perspective on this to John, because John hates that. So what I have found is the more hypertrophy phase we go, the poorer the ability to use oxygen tends to be. However, I have found the more eccentric we develop an athlete, the better the amount of oxygen availability tends to be. So that would be the difference between obviously building muscle up and lengthening muscle out.
Yeah, 100%.
Right. So is that a myofibril thing? Is that, I'm not sure. And I'm kind of, it's difficult, because what I'd like to do is take 10 athletes and completely jack them up in a safe, non-steroidal way, I may add, and look at the difference, right? Because interestingly, I was chatting to a cycling coach who had said to me, cycling is obviously predominantly lower leg, but they don't tend to hypertrophy up as much. They tend to lengthen out a lot more through that concentric, eccentric phase of the pedal. I don't know how true that is. You might know more about this than I do, because you're in that space.
Interesting.
Because cyclists have very good high level, have very good oxygen extraction. The highest levels of DSAT tend to be like -8, and it tends to be in the cycling community. So they've got that ability to extract it. Now, we've had a lot of athletes do sprints, and I think the best we tend typically to see is occasional a -8, but most sit -4 to -7. Combat athletes always sit under the -4.
Yeah.
So, okay, but that makes sense, because they don't need to extract as much as that as quick.
Yeah.
But it does beg the question on what should the muscle tonality be? Should you have much more hypertrophy-based work? Should you be building that? Should you be looking at isos? And should you be looking at, I don't know, eccentric? I mean, what is your thoughts on it?
Well, because that's an interesting one. Because I think for me, like the question, and this is more of a question, is from a mitochondria to cross-sectional area, the
Yeah.
ratio. Do you stretch that ratio in a way that you just know, like that you're essentially operating on a similar amount of mitochondria, and you're trying to oxygenate more muscle?
There will
And
be a
is
cost, though, won't there? The more muscle you've got, there is going to be an oxygen cost because you're going to have to fuel those myocytes. So you're going to have much more mitochondria. So it kind of could be the chicken and the egg story. It could be like if you build more muscle and you're just doing shortening and lengthening and you're just doing a lot of hypertrophy work, you're probably not building enough mitochondria with it. But
yes,
I suspect if you trained it right, however, and
yes,
you did a lot of high-end super maximal with it. Okay, and
yes,
this goes back to this interesting thing about the Halsey work and concurrent training methods, and this whole idea. And I was so when I did my masters, there was a point where I was kind of asked to look at concurrent training methods because there's a research paper on this whole idea. Obviously, for people that don't know that, if you do a weight training session, then follow it by like a cardio session, you downgrade your ability to kind of synthesize proteins through the mTOR restriction, because what happens is you do those kind of acyclic events, you get a lot more AMP, you get AMPK signaling, and then it kind of inhibits downstream mTOR. And that's been the big belief since I think 67 when Halsey did that big first study. But there's been studies that have come out recently that suggest that might not be the case. You may not get as much protein synthesis, but you're still going to get a percentage of it. But
yeah.
what you might get is a lot of mitochondrial development around it, and in which
That makes
case you may
sense
be
to
getting
me
both. Yeah, I would think
because
so. So yeah,
resistance training in itself isn't going to build the mitochondrial aspect, is it?
no, not on its own, no.
So yeah, see that's an interesting one for me, and I say this because with all of the like trends that I've seen with some of the fast twitch athletes, like the thing that stood out, and this was my initial assumption, was I thought that those types of athletes would desaturate very low and get close to zero.
Yeah,
That was my initial hypothesis, and what I found was essentially the exact opposite, where like the desaturation percentage wasn't a lot. And then my thought process was, is it the muscle composition itself, or is it the fact that there's just more of it? Because these guys do have more hypertrophy.
this is interesting, right? I'll tell you why it's interesting. So I had an athlete in the phenomenal, really, really phenomenal runner, um, really well developed hypertrophy wise, did phenomenal incremental treadmill. But when we actually did the mitochondria function test, when we do the long 5 minutes, most people after 5 minutes with that occlusion will bottom out. He did not bottom out.
Mm.
So initially I just thought it's just maybe one of these things, right? But I get another person in the gym that's ripped,
Yep.
shredded, same thing, same pattern, unable to fully extract the muscle oxygen, right? So the question is that good or is that bad? And I don't know, right? That's the truthful answer. We don't
Yes.
know. So, but it's interesting to me that both of them in a long occlusion of 5 minutes can't. So that then makes you
Yeah.
think, okay, so is that because there's a higher functional reserve of oxygen via the myoglobin storing it? Or is it just the
Mm.
inability to utilize the oxygen that's remaining in the tissue?
Yes.
So
100%.
right? So if that was the case, and therefore the premise was that you want to use that oxygen, then that wouldn't be such a good thing. Therefore, the hypothesis would be, I guess, that too much hypertrophy dampens down the ability to extract oxygen. Now, I suspect in some sports that may be a good thing. You
Yes.
kind of may
Yes.
not want to use
100%.
it,
Yes.
but in combat sports, I'm not so sure. So that's one of these. That's one of these ones that'll keep me up at 4 in the morning now. Wait a minute. Why is that? But that's the super cool thing about looking at this stuff, right? It's kind of like
Oh, there's so much. I would love to. I would love to get another couple of sensors and just start pulling in more information to add to what I have, so I could get more
yeah,
of a full picture with it.
it,
Because I
it's
do. That is probably one of the things I do wonder about in terms of like the limitations of being limited for sites. Um,
Yeah, so I think yes and no. So I mean, obviously I get 12 of them behind me. It gets a bit excessive. From a data perspective, it's pretty fascinating though. But the thing that I found consistently very difficult to do is get deltoids, get a good real signal on the deltoids. And the more we've done successful deltoids, the more I'm less inclined to be that interested in it. I don't think it gives you as much, and I think that makes sense because it's not as big a muscle, the shape of it, and that type of stuff, and the fiber on it's probably not brilliant for it. Rec fem and the legs are pretty fascinating for us. We've seen a lot of real super interesting things. Examples, the mid thigh pull. The mid thigh pull, we did the mid thigh pull and discovered that actually the hamstrings desaturate way more than the quadriceps do.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that was kind of like, I was like, holy shit. And then John's get this batshit vibration plate, right? So
I think we're one of those.
Yeah, so we've got Andy Marley. Shout out to Andy, our newly promoted black belt in BJJ. So Andy Marley's in and we're doing, now it could just be he's an anomaly, which could be the case. So Andy's doing mid-thigh pulls. And we're starting to see this really strange profile. So I've done it with other athletes and I've seen the same thing. The hamstrings bleed more in the mid-thigh pull than the quadriceps, which I was always led to believe was pretty much a quadricep dominated exercise, right? So that's got some interesting ramifications around that. But the batshit thing about it was we made Andy do lunges and hold static lunges on the vibration plate. And John's been, John's been on about this. John's been going on about this for ages, right? And that was insane. And I can't get my head around this. And we're going to do a research paper on this. Different frequencies cause different desaturation rates.
Really?
Yeah, it's woo-woos, right? But yeah, and certain frequencies, muscle oxygenation started to recover. So I was like, so that could just be, I guess, the microvascular nature, perhaps mini occlusions. If you think like if you think of the Mendelssohn stuff, then that would maybe make some sense. You get natural occlusions on a vibration, so it could be that. But I looked at it and I just thought this makes no sense. You know, like, and we made Andy do wall sets and all static holds, and we found that, and this was super interesting, which is why we need to do something with this. Is we had him kind of against the wall, almost like getting into clinch position.
Yeah.
And we noticed certain muscle groups were desaturating at a much faster level than other muscle groups. Which,
and I imagine there'd be a component of efficiency that comes with that, right? From someone who's experienced, like, and some of the adaptations that have come with developing that. That's so interesting.
So Andy would be an anomaly that because he's like he does kind of freestyle wrestling and stuff for the national team and stuff, so he's very high level. So he would be an anomaly. But we'd spoken this before. I think for me, I'm super interested in this whole idea of going from striking to clinch.
Yes.
And going from the ground up, because I think we probably don't appreciate how much energy systems are bleeding apart when someone's on top and holding you, or how much they're having to push. And I think, especially in the world of MMA, this is where we could see a lot of return on investment looking at that and working out ways of training that, because I think 100%. you see it a lot. It just, people get bled dry.
Yeah.
You know, especially when you think of kind of, you know, your Khabibs and their style of play where they want to hold you.
And you're right. If you're not used to it, you haven't got the right exposure to your body. Yeah.
So I want to combat this by looking at protocols to see how much is the energy cost in that, and can you efficiently handle that in a different way? Because irrespective, something like Khabib's going to hold you, you are going to bleed dry. But maybe there's ways that we can train to slow that bleeding down a little bit more in order to have a kind of competitive advantage, or kind of balance out the game a little bit. Because we're in this phase where the game is changing.
100%.
And I think, right, so technical ability is always a massive component in that, and the ability to kind of deal with that side of the ground game. But I think, again, it's one of these things, we haven't elicited what is the demands of it. So I think there's some really super cool stuff that's easy to do as well. And I think, you know, it just takes some of us to kind of get together and go, right, let's capture this data. And
I think it'd be so interesting to look at the difference between stylistic profiles as well, because I mean that's one of the unique components of MMA in terms of, you know, your background and the style that you utilize. It'd be very interesting to see same task what that actually looks like.
Yeah, because if you take, because we had started looking at, slightly different, but we didn't finish this project, but we mounted a force plate. We got it resined in and stuff. We did our technicians did a phenomenal job of putting a force plate on the wall for striking.
Did you?
Because I was, yeah,
Awesome.
we have got probably the
I
best
want
force
one.
plate mounted. Yeah, you say that. However, what you discover
Oh no.
is the technical ability to strike dictates the amount of force that's going to hit that plate. Because we've
Yes.
got, so here's a good example. So we had, at the time we had the pros in, we had a lot of them competing for WBC silvers. They were hitting 2,500 newtons for talking's sake. And then we had an ABA English female champion come in, and she hit more power in the jab.
Really?
Because technically it was a beautiful jab, great contraction, right? However, she couldn't do it moving, so she couldn't step in and generate the same amount of power. But when we put
Really?
the block,
Interesting.
but when we put the men and the women together and we statically went boom, hit it, it was a lot closer in values.
Wow.
But as soon as you went step in and hit it, which I'm a big believer of, because I'm not keen the force plate work that's out there, because a lot of it is from a static position. And I'm kind of like, it's not really.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get decent like transducers and focus pads so we can look at the kinetic motion of stepping in and hitting and striking.
Would you be able to differentiate between the force back on the pad? If that makes sense when you meet the strike?
Yeah, so you need to factor that in. You need to factor. So I tell you what's the biggest metric no one uses is retraction time. The ability to bring the hand back, right? So I'm religious in this with the kids when they box. I'm like, hand back. And I always explain to them that if you don't bring the hand back to the same place, it doesn't start from the same place. So therefore, you differentiate where your power is. This is why I don't like landmine presses. It's not because of all the other shit. The reason I don't like landmine presses is it encourages very bad habits in retraction.
Yeah.
So what happens is people don't bring the hand back to the same position. So if you're doing a double backhand and you throw out and you get very lazy in the pullback, then the amount of force that you're going to generate is going to change because the distance is altered.
It's a great example. It's a great example of relating back to the sport, right?
Yeah. So for me, if I'm going to do minutia work and I'm going to do very fine work, it's in the sport context on the pads.
Yeah.
I don't want power or force trained in that environment because it's too fine, a granular. I want force a bit more generalized so that strength is a bit more generalized and then dial that in. So I've lost track where I was going with this. But yeah, so yes, hand on, hand off time. So you're right, on a focus pad, what you would need to do, I suspect, and we've got it all set up to do it because we've got the 3D motion capture suite, would be calculate the time coming back off and then calculate against it. And one of the reasons why we didn't complete the paper, and we've got all the data, was I just felt that we could turn that paper out tomorrow and the whole world would be like, blah, 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 blah. But I would know it wasn't a true reflection of what actually takes place in sport. And I wouldn't want people going away thinking that if we could buy a force plate and we just chuck it in the wall and we're hitting 3,500 newtons, we've got world-class strikers. And I was really quite cautious of that. I didn't want to do it because I just feel statically it's not really real. And we had ground reaction force as well. So we had the force plate in the ground as well. So we were measuring both.
That's awesome.
And it was an interesting thing. But as soon as you make it dynamic and the mechanics change, everything changes. So the girl that had the most technically astute single jab that could generate massive power couldn't do it when she had to step in. And that was bizarre to me. I watched and I was like, holy fuck, you can hit this amazing. But if I ask you to step back, shadow box a little bit, and I go, step in and hit it, you can't do it.
I was really interested at one point doing some research regarding striking a force plate. And what I was interested in was not so much the forces. I was interested in the force curve from impact between higher and lower level athletes. I'm not sure if you've got any insight into that in terms of, because I think, you look like the power cubes. And my assumption is, and this is just an assumption, that they're a very force bias. It provides a very force bias metric, but I'm not necessarily sure that is indicative of an effective punch, if that makes sense, or the most effective punch.
So I've I've had the luxury of using it, and I was not convinced that the data was particularly reliable in my experience compared to a classic force plate where we could theoretically replicate the values. So, but we'll follow up on this another time because I know you need to shoot off and moving on. This is quite a long chat.
A good chat.
So, Bill Smart, thank you very much for being the first guest in the We Do Performance podcast.